Hello there, everyone. So before we start, I just wanted to thank every single person who donated to me so I could get a new microphone. In case you didn't see my last news update video, my microphone broke halfway through recording. Though even if you didn't help me afford a new microphone, I just want to let you know that I'll appreciate you just for watching and commenting. But yeah, if you can't tell, my new microphone is still coming in the mail, so I apologize in advance for the quality of this video. I asked about this in the last video as well, and the overwhelming majority of my viewers said that I should continue to upload, even though I'm stuck with this shitty webcam mic for the time being. So if you're not a fan, yeah, I'm not going to be doing too many more videos with this type of sound quality, so don't worry. So, the gaming industry for the last couple of years hasn't been in really good shape, and before someone asks, I don't fucking know why I've been talking about gaming news so much lately either. I suspect it has something to do with the development of that private server I'm involved in, which I spoke about in detail in my guest spot on Filthy Heretic's intellectual property video. You know, it's kind of occupying a lot of my work right now, so it's no wonder why it becomes a big interest of mine. Anyway, there have been a handful of issues plaguing the console gaming market, which is different from the MMO market or the mobile market because of the pay model of a console game or a game that you buy for the PC versus the others. But there is one issue applying to all three different markets, which is of loot box transactions and the increased cost of playing games as a result, along with game development being heavily centered around online play and expansion packs being sold later after the release dates in updates instead of companies just releasing completed games and releasing games in pre-alpha. Well, unfortunately but unsurprisingly, it doesn't look like things are going to be improving anytime soon, as we're about to discuss in today's video. Firstly, you have this story which just recently came out. Well, this isn't necessarily targeting the gaming market, but it is going to affect the gaming market. But the US government and the Chinese government have recently started a trade war. What is that? Well, basically a trend of creating tariffs and other protectionist regulations to pretend as if the two governments are somehow creating prosperity. Yeah, the propaganda narratives created by the media and the politicians don't even really try and explain how this is beneficial. They just appeal to nationalism and baselessly moral fag about how American companies are being treated unfairly by them dirty Chinese companies. Of course, they never explain how trade in the United States is declining because of China. They just resort to using political speak phrases designed to prod at the emotions of the viewer. One I've heard quite a bit from the likes of Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham, for example, is stealing our intellectual property. What the fuck does that even mean? Well, turns out what they're referring to is some Chinese manufacturers using the same tools and methods to produce commodities as the US companies do. So, it doesn't really have anything to do with theft, and instead is just a really Orwellian way of saying that producers in China are competing with producers in the US on the international markets. But in reality, the governments in question are just making both of their populations poorer by creating artificial scarcity, while the politicians of the said countries measure each other's dicks and compare sizes. Now, I've made a video as to why tariffs aren't beneficial for the economy, but for those who are new and aren't aware of this or haven't seen any of my videos explaining it, I uploaded it a while back. It was about a year ago, so it would be understandable if you haven't. Tariffs create scarcity by artificially increasing the cost of production for the commodities in the industries being taxed. All taxes and regulations have this effect. I know for most people that goes without saying, but some statists will fall back on or try to argue that, oh, well, those were just bad regulations. Regulations can produce prosperity if they were good and implemented correctly. That's if they're even intellectually honest enough to admit that regulatory capture was the problem instead of free markets. Of course, no, since all taxes and government restrictions on trade have this effect and in turn artificially increase the cost of living and reduce the amount of available resources people have to consume and produce with, there by default cannot be a tax or regulation which does not create artificial scarcity and in turn create poverty. Anyway, there's going to be a 25% tariff on all Chinese exports to the United States, with the exceptions of medicine and minerals. Guess the state figured that those commodities are already so expensive because of licensing laws and patent boards creating state-granted monopolies, state-created firms competing with private producers which mismanage resources because they have significantly less marginal utility for their commodities, and heavy taxation among various other ways the state intervenes in those markets, that if they taxed that market any more, people would start creating counter economies to trade around them and deprive them of revenue and speculate with their resources instead of buying and trading in that market, trying to produce commodities to create new models of business and new models of creating these commodities which are cheaper than what can be found in the legal markets. I mean, open source medicine and CRISPR are a thing now, so they're a bit late on that one. Anyway, digressing, this means that physical games and game consoles are going to skyrocket in price since the majority of them are manufactured in China. But as noted, you also have loot boxes. Now, I don't think I need to explain the problem with loot boxes because some of the bigger government shills on YouTube who present themselves as gaming commentators like Yang Yi or Jim Sterling have beaten this topic to death already. Basically, it's an inefficient and costly model of in-game transactions both for the consumer and the developers, where players pay through microtransactions for items typically referred to as crates or boxes that once activated generate a fixed number of items at a random rate which typically can't otherwise be obtained through normal gameplay. Now, there are real arguments to be made against incorporating loot boxes into video games as a model of monetization. For starters, they've been demonstrably shown to not even be profitable for the larger AAA producers which engage in this practice. EA, for example, after their dismal Battlefront 2 launch, which itself was ripe with enough controversy that it could require its own video to go over all of it, lost $350 million in net profit, and stock prices dropped from $2 a share to 72 cents a share, which amounted to a loss in net bookings of about $30 million. They lost a total of about $3 billion in total shareholder value. On top of that, EA has had a net loss of employees due to layoffs of nearly 10,000 jobs, which to put into perspective is roughly 5% of their entire corporation. But for some reason, the biggest and most outspoken channels, which top YouTube's algorithms for some reason, want to make the weakest and least compelling arguments regarding this practice, ranging from unironic think of the children scaremongering arguments to misusing already dubious scientific studies regarding behavioral psychology and how animals react to certain stimuli, specifically the B.F. Skinner study on operant conditioning, outside of their original context to mislead people and make quasi-intellectual arguments about addictions and how loot boxes supposedly can psychologically manipulate people into continuing to shell out more and more money for loot boxes with contradictory arguments to support their case, such as people being forced to buy loot boxes to progress in games, but also buying loot boxes because of operant conditioning. And it would require an entire video in and of itself to go over the B.F. Skinner study in detail, but for those who aren't aware but want a basic rundown, it's a study where a psychologist, B.F. Skinner, took a series of rats and locked them into individually separate small boxes for several days, and the only thing inside of the box being a lever and a dispenser for food, which is triggered once the rat pulls the lever. What Skinner was testing was a particular expansion onto the theory of stimulus response, which he theorized were responses not only elicited from external stimuli, but also could be emitted from the test subject in his study because of external stimuli. In other words, it's pretty uncontroversial that the neural development of human brains is shaped largely by the environment of each individual in question. Long-term psychological traits developed by how individuals develop in contrast with their environment would be considered an elicited response. But what B.F. Skinner wanted to prove was that environment could also compel responses from individuals directly, which would be an emitted response. In other words, he was a proponent of hard determinism. And the purported intent and conclusion of this study, according to Skinner, was to prove that hard determinism is legitimate. And for some reason, sophists like Yang Yi, Jim Sterling, and politicians throughout the last few decades advocating for government expansion and restrictions on the trading of certain commodities, i.e., making them artificially scarce, such as gambling and cigarette usage, do so by citing B.F. Skinner's study on operant conditioning as if it's some sort of established, well-documented, widely accepted fact and is comparable to consumer trends and behaviors, when in reality there's an overwhelming amount of evidence in past advertising alone which prove B.F. Skinner's study at the very least doesn't apply to consumer behaviors and trends. Pretty much any new brand or ad campaign which has ever failed alone is proof that this argumentation is completely nonsensical. But there have been media companies which have literally tried to employ this exact same tactic in advertising decades before B.F. Skinner's experiment, commonly referred to as subliminal messaging. Most famously of which was James Vicery's popcorn experiment, which a lot of statist shills point to as proof that subliminal advertising is effective, because Vicery initially claimed that his study was a success and was able to boost popcorn sales for the movie theater company he was contracted for. But what they conveniently leave out is that Vicery was forced to admit that the published results of his study were exaggerated due to other companies and psychologists being unable to reproduce the same results. On top of that, operant conditioning in the conclusion Skinner purported is probably one of, if not the most hotly debated and controversial argument of the last 200 years, as it flies directly in the face of most established contributions to metaphysical philosophy and psychology, such as Kantianism and empiricism. In fact, Skinner was probably most controversial as a figure, specifically for his incredibly hostile attitude towards the work of Sigmund Freud. He also was formally criticized by some of the largest figures in academia, such as J.E.R. Stadden, who argued that if determinism was correct, humans wouldn't have the ability to develop unique and complex individual traits, and Noam Chomsky, yes, that Noam Chomsky, also argued a similar point, adding that Skinner's tests on animals couldn't be applied to humans, and by attempting to apply these results to a human society, Skinner was engaging in scientism. Chomsky, by the way, is a determinist, and Stadden was a compatibilist. So even among prominent philosophers who agreed with his premise, or at the very least were sympathetic, Skinner's study was and still is incredibly controversial. I mean, the fact that games with loot boxes are not doing well financially, and companies which add loot box monetization systems to their games are losing billions of dollars alone completely shits all over this idea. Well, if you haven't recognized by my very blunt allusions to this, and by the overtly manipulative and political language being employed by these sophists, they aren't attempting to make actual intellectually honest and stimulating arguments against the practice or suggest something better, a more constructive alternative. What they're trying to do is they're trying to amplify the call for governments to ban in-game transactions, i.e., threaten producers with violence if they don't comply with some FCC or FTC regulation in order for the government to justify creating a said regulation, which will artificially increase the cost of production and make development for games so bureaucratic and costly that no developers other than the AAA companies that these fuckwits are claiming that they despise are going to be able to produce games within the legal markets. Which makes sense that content creators shilling for the state like this avoid the obvious arguments and throw themselves through a series of mental gymnastics to try and convince their audience that the points that they're making, using what amounts to emotive and meaningless buzzwords, fear-mongering tactics, and reaching the bottom of the barrel for any academic study, regardless of its validity, and flaunt it around in some pseudo-intellectual attempt to try and scientifically validate their argument, which rests upon an already unscientific flawed premise of assuming that humans can value certain products the same. But yeah, as you can see, now there's an actual bill proposed, which is gaining traction in the mainstream media, and let's be honest, is probably going to end up becoming a law, just like EA and all these other AAA publishers want it to, because it gets rid of all of their competition and grants them effectively legal oligopolies on the console market. I mean, there's a reason why it's becoming so popular in the mainstream media. If it wasn't an idea which was promoted by corporations and the state, it wouldn't even be in the mainstream media in the first place. So, on top of the 25% tariff on video game consoles and the games themselves, the new regulation on what producers can and can't put in their games, there are going to be fewer competing games on the market, which is also going to increase costs due to scarcity of resources available due to the amount of purchases occurring declining drastically and fewer producers being able to obtain fewer resources as a result. If you're a console gamer or just someone who buys games still, if you want anything right now that you aren't willing to wait many years for, you better buy it and switch to PC, because I'd bet you, after all these laws pass, that you aren't going to be able to afford another game or console for a very, very long time. And even if you can, I hope you like EA, Microsoft, Activision, Sony, Ubisoft, or Nintendo games, because that's pretty much going to be your only variety. Oh, and since they have less competition, yeah, you can expect the quality of the hardware and games on the market to decline even further. And let's get this on record right now, because I seriously am willing to wager the fucking price difference between a current gen console as of right now and the price of a current gen console after all these laws pass. That the charlatans like Yang Yi, Jim Sterling, Review Tech USA, B. Dobbins, and the senator who proposed this loot box bill, Josh Hawley, immediately after the prices skyrocket, are going to start blaming market practices and call for more regulation. Like, studiously doing anything they can, absolutely everything they can, to avoid the obvious, even though the people who knew what they were talking about were warning them long in advance what happened after the laws eventually passed was going to happen because of the laws. This is the main of many reasons why I don't take arguments for trade protectionism seriously on an intellectual standpoint. But anyway, politicians and media personalities say all sorts of things about the bill, that it's just about loot boxes or that EA wouldn't gain anything from it. If you people just did 5 minutes of fucking research and actually found the PDF online for yourself, well, more like 10 because Google tried pretty hard to bury it, and I admittedly had a pretty hard time trying to find it. Gee, I wonder why that is. You'd find that this bill is written almost entirely in euphemisms and imprecise language, which I'm pretty sure I know why they didn't define a lot of their terms, because the last Lootbox bill we went over from the state of Hawaii, which was in my response to B. Dobbins, was more precise and specified what it meant in some of the terms that it used, and that sucker would have ended up outlawing cell phones, so it's no wonder why they try to hide the actual bill PDF online and don't define their terms very well. One that you see sprinkled all over this bill is the term miner-oriented game. Well, you run into objective problems with this right away on the first page. Since there's no stated definition of what this means, there's no exclusion for what this could mean other than the commodity in question being a game. And on top of that, immediately on the following page, the bill states that all games can't include quote-unquote pay-to-win microtransactions. So defining something as a miner-oriented product or miner-oriented game is completely pointless. Which is another thing. How does the bill define pay-to-win? Then, not even another page later, you start running into some big fucking problems, which are definitely not being conveyed by the shills in the mainstream media and the politicians, which make this far, far fucking worse. Not even a page later, the bill starts talking about FTC licensing laws for anyone manufacturing quote-unquote miner-oriented games. Oh, my bad. The document does go on to actually try and define what a game publisher and a miner-oriented game are. And guess what? It's far fucking worse than even previously suspected. Well, apparently, again, just like the Hawaiian bill, they define a game publisher as a producer which manufactures any digital product. So, computers, cell phones. Guess what? Now they basically can't have premium app stores according to the US government. As for miner-oriented games, they define this as, quote, any digital product which contains music, characters, art, and subject matter designed to appeal to people who are under the age of 18. And since there's no objective criteria for what appeals to someone under versus what appeals to someone over the age of 18 in terms of media consumption, this basically just means anything that the state wants it to. I mean, my fucking god, do I honestly even need to continue? That's 4 pages into an 18-page long bill regarding microtransactions, not counting the title page, and already it's illegal to manufacture any digital product without a license from the FTC in a state-regulated legal market. The author of this bill had to have known what he was implying by using equivocation arguments, redefining words, and by trying to be as vague as possible. Otherwise, the bill wouldn't have been more than 2 pages long, and the author would have simply used the colloquial definitions instead of going out of his way and putting more time and effort into arbitrarily redefining words to try and trick people into thinking that this bill is about getting rid of loot boxes, when in reality it would have the state doing far more. And even if it was, as I went over earlier, even if it was about getting loot boxes off the market, that's still not the approach you want to take if you don't like loot boxes. And fuck the shills in the media who deliberately lie to people in the gaming subculture, appealing to people deliberately seeking escapism, who of course probably are not going to be well informed on economics, politics, or philosophy, and manipulate them into becoming cultists in the religion of government. That is an actual exploitative and predatory practice. But it shouldn't surprise me because the media and the government have done this essentially on an institutionalized level through government schooling. And you may be asking, well, why do these AAA developers put loot boxes in their games if it's not a profitable practice? Well, it's simple. Firstly, you have the government directly subsidizing them, giving them less incentive to compete and less marginal utility with their resources, making them more prone to mismanagement, and brand monopolization created by copyright laws, just to name a few of the issues. But anyway, before I go, if you really want to end these sort of practices, speculate with some resources into designing a new model of network based around a new monetization system, which is more efficient. That's what I and Douglas Terabyte are going to do shortly after we finish up with FNet, and that's the way you achieve real market changes. The only thing the government can do is make things more expensive and shittier. On top of that, based on how expensive games and consoles are going to be, and speaking of which, it wouldn't surprise me if most gamers ended up becoming counter-economists and doing just that, developing new networks and modes of trade which are decentralized, more efficient, and profitable, and torrenting begins to explode in popularity. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.